Kia ora everybody, welcome to this lunchtime webinar. This is the last in our series of 4 webinars that we've been giving the industry over the last few months. Today's webinar is called Walking the Talk, and we're going to be just talking briefly about planning and designing for pedestrians. This is a topic very close to our hearts. I am Jeanette Ward. I'm a technical director here at Abley, and today I'm joined by my colleague Tracy Fleming. So now I am going to share my screen and hopefully that will all come through. Excellent. So Tracy and I will now turn off our cameras because we're just conscious of making sure you see the full slides, and then we'll pop them back on at the end of the presentations. Okay, so I'm just going to talk to you today about basically the guidance side of things. So we have 2 topics for you today, and I'm just trying to get my mouse onto slide deck. Bear with me. Here we are. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, so today we're going to talk about walking related guidance, and then I'm going to hand over to Tracy to talk about walkability. If you have any questions today, please pop them into the chat and we will address those at the end. We're planning to talk for 10 minutes each and then allow 10 minutes for questions. So when we start talking about guidance, I think it's really important to understand why guidance is important. It ensures that people are using best practice. It encourages a consideration of all types of pedestrians, which has been a bit of a weakness in the past and has resulted in environments that can be unfriendly for people, particularly people with disabilities. Guidance also promotes environments that are consistent, and again, this is particularly important for people with disabilities. The guidance can be used by a range of professions, so it's not just engineers, it's people, planners, it's urban designers, landscape architects, and surveyors, the list goes on. Guidance can also be referenced in reviews and audits. So, for example, when I do a safety audit, I often reference guidance as part of my commentary on an issue I might have raised so that people can find where the actual guidance is. It can also be referenced in submissions. So if someone's putting together a submission on a project and they spot something that's not quite right, and they know that the guidance covers that, they can provide a reference to that. So what have we got in New Zealand? We currently have the Pedestrian Planning and Design Guide, and there's been a project underway for the last few years to replace it with the Pedestrian Network Guidance. And the news flash that I can give you today is that tomorrow the PNG is going to go live on the Waka Kotahi website. So I put the hyperlink there, pretty easy to remember. This has been a real ongoing journey for a lot of us, not just myself and my colleague Anne-Marie here at Abley, but also the team at Via Strada and MR Cagney. So we've been working closely with Waka Kotahi and also the disability sector to develop this content. So it's all online now and it's around 85% complete. There are some topic areas that are still being worked on, but we wanted to get something out there now. So please do go and have a look. There is an email address that people can give feedback to, or also a survey which asks you specific questions about the content. There's going to be a promotion of the PNG shortly in various forms, such as webinars, from a dissemination and training point of view, so keep an eye out for those. So when you go to the PNG tomorrow, you'll see this on the landing page. So it's very similar to the other Waka Kotahi websites where they're using tiles for each topic to access an area. Then when you pop onto one of those tiles, you're going to see a bit more detail. So for example, I've just clicked on planning, and those are the topics you'll see. And when you go into those, of course, you'll get far more information. There are lots of other sources of guidance out there, and these are still relevant, and you'll notice when you do start using the PNG that we've actually embedded a lot of that guidance into the PNG with links. So, for example, it might be that Austroads has a particular aspect that's useful, but also local guidance such as AT has quite a wide variety of guidance that's relevant as well. So what are the key changes that have happened since the PPDG was published some years ago? Well, we asked the industry about this a few years ago, and essentially we've been working through a list of all the things that people wanted to see and the things that we know about that have changed. So here's a few key changes. There's far more extensive planning guidance. There's personas and case studies to make it real, because guidance needs to be related back to human beings and real life situations. Minimum footpath widths have been updated. So in some contexts, they've increased. For example, a standard 1.5 footpath on a residential street is now recommended to be 1.8, which a lot of councils are doing anyway. There's also a more detailed crossing selection process to help with that decision on the type of crossing. Promotion of lower speeds, that's embedded throughout, that's critical to pedestrian safety and pedestrian environments. There's also a greater recognition of the crime prevention through environmental design principles. And we can't forget construction and maintenance practices for walking. So there is, they are two of the topics that aren't up there yet, but they will be really useful to pass on to people working on those areas. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of how guidance might be applied. So this is an example just around the corner from my house where a railway bridge was replaced. So this wasn't a street design project or anything like that. It was a bridge renewal. And you can see that the old bridge on the left had a very narrow footpath, and when you went into that, you couldn't actually see who was coming from the other side. So when they replaced the bridge, they actually moved the abutment back, and that enabled a much wider footpath to be built. So essentially that's following best practice guidance. That footpath previously was around 1.2 metres. And now you can actually see who's coming from the other direction, which is great. Here's an example of a street renewal where you can see on the left-hand side, the before, at night, the landscaping was densely located next to the curb, and the old sodium lighting made it very hard for people to actually be seen walking along that footpath. So the new design has taken that septed stuff into consideration and made sure that there are still street trees, but they're far further apart, and the new LED lighting has made it really nice and bright. And it was also reduced to 30 kilometres an hour. So these are, again, aspects you will see embedded throughout the guidance. So one of the things that came through loud and clear from the industry was around how do you decide which type of crossing to go, and we were seeing people having concerns about the wrong types of crossing. So now you'll see in the PNG, we have an approach that allows people to work through a bit of a decision-making process through a flowchart, and then there is what we call a context table, which applies to each type of crossing to help you then sort of refine down your options to a preferred option. So I'm just going to briefly talk about a couple of crossing scenarios. So this is a key question that pops up: when to use a flush or a raised zebra. So the example here on the left is actually where I saw a near miss yesterday on my way into work. There is a school there on the left, and a dad had taken his kids into school, and then he was crossing the zebra. A vehicle, or the distracted driver, basically just missed him. So that was a real wake-up call, I think, for that driver. Like, he just had no idea about what was happening around him. So that kind of scenario, you might actually say, well, a raised platform underneath that zebra would be a much better outcome. And these are fairly kind of typical scenarios all around our network. But then the example on the right there is a new street design where it's going to be 30 kilometres an hour. There's a lot of people around, very low traffic volumes, 30k speed limit. You could say maybe you just let people wander, but actually in this case, it was felt that some kind of priority crossing was needed for mobility impaired users. So this is a scenario where a flush zebra would actually be fine. And then the other big question that people often have to grapple with is when to use a courtesy crossing or maybe some other type of crossing. So the guidance goes into some real encouraging kind of scenarios of where it might be possible or where actually no, don't do that. The image on the left, that is a courtesy crossing in a really low speed, low traffic volume, high place area down in Britomart from memory, and that works really well. Drivers get that. The scenario on the right is a higher volume road. It also has buses on it. And even though it's on a kind of raised platform and looks like a courtesy crossing, in reality, it doesn't actually work like that. So maybe with the high volumes of pedestrians in that area, a zebra might have been better. So these are the kind of things that the PNG will cover and hopefully give you some more clarity on what type of crossing might be appropriate where. As I said earlier, please go and take a look tomorrow or whenever you get round to it and have a look at the crossing selection in particular. We're very keen to see how it works for you by trying it out on a few scenarios. So thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Tracy.
Great, thanks, Jeanette. Okay, just checking my technology is working. Jeanette, I might need. I'm using some very flash technology. There we go, brilliant. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking to you about today is walkability, and that has there's a big section in the pedestrian network guidance on walkability. For today's purposes, I've tried to condense the definition of walkability into one sentence, which, as you can imagine, is quite challenging. In the guidance, we do have several different definitions of walkability, but for today's purposes, I've just summarised it as built environments that support walking by connecting people to destinations, something relatively simple, you'd think, to achieve. And some of the key factors that create a walkable environment, the priorities are safety and comfort that have come out of lots of research that's been done. But on the right-hand side of the screen there, we've got the 7 pedestrian network characteristics that are embedded within the pedestrian network guidance, which also outlines some of the other key things as well. So inclusive design is just underpinning everything that we do, and obviously Jeanette's talked about the importance of crossings and making sure that there's safe outcomes for everybody there. The quote on the left hand side there is just a quote from some engagement that we did over on the West Coast a couple of years ago, and it just backs up what all the research says. People want to be safe and then have the attractive environment into it, and that's what makes things walkable for people. So talking about walkability in terms of people and place, we all know the diagram there up on the top left hand corner, the wide range of users that we have. So people with mobility and visual impairments, even within their own group, have very different needs. So people using canes use the street in a different way to people using who have guide dogs to help them along. We've also got just big groups of kids going to school, hopefully walking to school. And as a recent graduate of maternity leave, sort of people just walking side by side with prams has always been quite a challenge. So the increase of the path width to 1.8 meters will help achieve a lot of the aims of creating a nicer environment for people to be walking in. We also need to consider the time of day people are using our streets and the purpose that people use our streets. So even as an individual, my needs change, or what I think is important changes depending on the purpose of my trip. So if I was walking to work, I just want the quickest, most direct route and quickest crossing options. That varies very much if I'm doing a recreational trip at the weekend with my family. So we've just got to take that into consideration when we are designing environments to cater for everything that these streets are going to do. On the right hand side there, you see the One Network Framework place and movement graph, which is again embedded in the pedestrian network guidance and tools that have been developed. So rather than a more traditional approach where the focus has been on sort of providing for cars and then fitting everything else around there, the framework's changing so that we're actually looking at the place function of an environment. So pedestrian activity is very much a focus within the local streets and even all the way up to city hubs as well. But you can see there's a very big shift in policy frameworks and design outcomes that will make things better for walking. So how do we assess walkability? I won't go through all of this because there's quite a lot of information out there on different a wide range of tools, but I've just picked out a couple of tools that have I've been dealing with in even the last week at work. So PERS is the pedestrian environment review system that the Transport Research Laboratory over in the UK created a few years ago. That and things like valuing the urban realm have monetized benefits to the walking environment. There's also Healthy Streets, which is the bottom left image there, and that's Lucy Saunders prepared that, and she came over a few years ago. And one of the things that I think that was a really good outcome from that was it was a really good engagement tool. So I remember Lucy saying, sort of, it's very difficult for people to say they don't want an area to be safe. People feel safe in an area, whereas we all know if as technical people, when you go out doing a walking, cycling scheme or a public transport scheme, there's often a little bit of negative outcomes sometimes, but it was a really good tool to pull everything together. But what has happened, Anne-Marie, Becky and Dave Smith in our office were involved in the pedestrian level of research, service research published in 2020. So I've provided a link to the guidance document, so I won't take you through all of that today. But the pedestrian network guidance also has a link to the tool that's been developed as part of that research, and that will take you through what this assessment does. But what I did think I'd do for you today is just take you through the results of an assessment that's gone through the level of service assessment. And as you can see, you get a graph output, and you can assess the current environment and an option. So whether you're doing an option to increase the footpath width or add crossings in, you can actually assess two different options within the same framework. And you can see that it actually scores things on a weighted basis. So whether people are safe from vehicles, there's safe and appropriate crossings, secure, the paths are good, and pleasant and attractive environment. So, and you can see that priority of safety is there in the options. And for this particular street in Randall Street in Christchurch, the results, we always love a before and after. So here is the before and after for this street, and you can see how if you look back at this scoring system, you can see that the safe and appropriate crossings was scoring higher on the option and high quality paths, and you can see that here there's far more space for footpaths and really good separation in between the pedestrians and vehicles, and narrowed points for pedestrians crossing at the intersection. So it's a really nice tool to use just to have a holistic look of what improvements are required for pedestrian environments in existing situations. we talk, but what is a walkable street? And it gets back to what the importance of guidance and the design framework that's within the pedestrian network guidance. So things like wider footpaths, so the minimum width of 1.8 metres that Jeanette's already highlighted, that's a really good step in just trying to achieve everything that we want to do in our spaces. Surfacing's always a really important thing, so you know, nice smooth surfaces, asphalt was a really big thing when we've been working over in the West Coast communities. Things like good crossings, we've already talked about that with Jeanette, but sort of having appropriate and safe crossings that provide options for everybody using the footpaths. Something very close to my heart, those of you who know me, but tactile indicators, making sure that they are done correctly the first time round. That separation from traffic that I just talked about in the last image, it's just much, people actually quite like it when there's just a little bit of separation from you and the traffic lane. And the key outcomes are that there's space to socialise and people actually spend time in these streets. And the presence of trees is always something that people appreciate in walkable environments, and the birds come with trees, so they're not automatically there. And the real outcome is that we get more people walking more often and enjoying their time in their local environments. How does this look though? What's success in this environment? So on the left hand side there, we've got the Open Play Streets project that Jeanette was involved in. So that was just closing off a street in Christchurch. The ability just to spend time and space in our local streets and engage with our local communities is absolutely critical. On the right hand side there, there's a Wellington example of one of the innovating streets type projects where we're just sort of changing the feel of an area just by using colour. Here's an example from Reefton. So this was a really big one. So this section of footpath links the campsite to Reefton town centre. On the right hand side is how it looked before. There's the accessible toilets at the bottom right, left hand side of this photograph. And then after our project started, there was a nice resurfing to asphalt, so everybody really enjoyed that. This is my street in Christchurch. It's been in the snow book. I'm rather proud of it, but you can still see, even with litter bins out there, it's still a very nice walkable street to enjoy, to spend time on and enjoy being in. So tips to assess walkability, these are the really important things. You can do desktop assessments, that's fine, but getting out there really gets you to know what's going on. A lot happens between 9 and 5, so really get out there during the time of day that these streets are being used. Use feedback to councils that's been provided, so that's either through LTP processes or feedback through community groups. And then just talking to local people, local knowledge is priceless. We don't know everything, so just get that out there and talk to people. And now I will pass back to Jeanette for any questions.
Yeah, so do feel free to put some questions in the chat. We've got one from James Park. Hi, James. James was asking about micromobility features and how does this come into it all. Parked scooters and bicycles for hire are more and more common problem across New Zealand. And of course, you're dead right. It's often we come walking down a footpath and someone's dumped a scooter in the middle of it. So one of the things that we have in the guidance is just some examples of ways you could try and contain that, particularly in areas where they're being more used in sort of denser areas. So Auckland trialled, and I don't know what the outcome was, but they had small planter box sort of areas set aside. And even on Queen Street, I think they took out a car park space or half a car park space at least, and designated that for the parking of scooters, just to get it out of the footpath, because obviously in a place like Queen Street, you certainly do not want that kind of blockage in the footpath. Ken, yes, we will make those presentations available, and I'll find out about those other 3 as well. I'm sure they'll be available. We can flick you a link. Okay. Hi, Tyler, how are you? All the way from Canada, if I'm correct. Has there been any movement on changes to right-of-way laws that prioritise people walking instead of what was in place where drivers had priority and people walking had to yield? So in New Zealand, we have quite a few shared space streets, which might be a really good example of where the drivers are guests. So they actually come into the space and are expected to yield to the pedestrians just through the way that the design is all set up and what have you. In terms of the law, I think there is something around that expectation of courtesy and giving way. Do you recall, Tracy, exactly what the traffic control devices rule has on that?
Not specifically. It's not changed towards the sort of the Netherlands approach yet, but I know that that has been looked at in some ways. But yeah, we do have our guidance, and I think we're just watching and waiting, I think, to do the changes with things as appropriate.
Okay, Claire Scott, you have to go. Great to see you too, briefly. Andrew Ross has asked about the situation where you do get a better lighting outcome, but it can be at the expense of reduced shade, which is certainly not so good in Queensland, where Andrew comes from. I don't actually have any examples off the top of my head where mature trees have been retained for that lighting and the lighting has been improved. I feel like there must be, but I'm very sorry, Andrew, I don't have any off the top of my head. It'd be a really good example to have. I guess in New Zealand, we're not, too worried about shade as much as you are over in Queensland. Sadly, we'd love to have more on shade, more need for shade. Okay, any more questions? We just got a couple of minutes left before we close off. I'll just, well, what has Andrew said here? Thanks, Jeanette. It's a challenging one, often because existing lights are trained on the road rather than the footpath. Yes, you did right. I have seen examples of streetlight poles where they do have that lower arm on the footpath side. So you have your street light higher and then a lower one. So potentially that could be a solution if that's then located between the trees along the street. That might be a way of dealing with that. Certainly seen that where there is a really busy footpath or shared path and they've had both the street light and the pedestrian light on the same pole with a reasonable outreach. Okay, Ken, any favourites for raised crossing across side streets that includes cycle lane on primary roads? I love a good raised crossing across a side street, I have to say, and they're becoming very well utilised, particularly in busy pedestrian areas or near schools, in a way of, slowing that side road traffic down, both exiting and entering the street. And if the question is around the cycle lane being on the main road. I think that's fine. If it's an on-road cycle lane, it's not really impacted by having those raised crossing across side streets. I know on some separated cycleways as well, they do manage to have the raised crossing as well. Okay, and Tyler's pointed out to Ken that there's some good examples of that in a town in Canada. Just around the changes to minimum footpath width. So if you're familiar with the PPDG, it had a context table for different situations. So you have a residential street with a reasonably low volume versus those really big town centre areas, central city areas. So that table is still there, but the numbers have increased. And really what I would recommend is you go and have a look at that table. But what we've pointed out today is the key change is the minimum width for residential streets being increased from 1.5. Just because we've got so many more users of the footpath with different devices. If you've got two mobility scooters coming towards each other, then really important to have that 1.8. Otherwise, you get into a bit of a situation where one might have to use a landscaping or whatever. So there are changes across the board, but please do go and have a look at that table.
And just to add to that, Jeanette, that's the accessible width, so that there's other elements to the footpath in that table as well that people need to consider.
Yeah, so we've called, I think we've called it the clear through route. So there are other zones in the footpath, such as furniture zones, etc. So they are also included in the table. But what's really important, as Tracy said, is that accessible path width. So something like Queen Street may have a really wide curbed building area, but it's really important that some of that is kept nice and clear and consistent along the route as well. Mark Edwards has just clarified that the Land Transport Act clauses cover general behaviour to all road users. The TCD rule does not cover this aspect. It isn't the purpose of the TCD rule. Shared space is a departure from the current norm that then place pedestrians above motor vehicles in the roadway as a result. Thank you, Mark, for clarifying that. That's awesome. James Park, is there no specific guidance on street lighting requirements on footpaths in the new guides? So there will be, that section isn't in there yet, James, but there will be some examples, but often a lot of it will go back to the Australian New Zealand standard for street lighting as well, particularly important at crossings. So we will try and find some really good examples. I'm quite interested in the Queensland scenario there of how you also retain trees. So it's a work in progress, that section. So it's good that people are really interested to see how that would work out. Is rolling out the low traffic neighbourhood streets considered in the guidance? Yes, so we have in the planning section a range of different tools that people can use to create, more walkable, pedestrian friendly environments, and low traffic neighbourhoods are a real key tool in that. So there is reference to it as a tool. We're hoping that there'll be some more kind of national guidance on how that's actually built on the ground and what are the different ways people can do it, because at the moment there isn't necessarily any kind of waka kotahi guidance about that yet, and when that comes we can then link to it, but they are certainly mentioned as a really useful tool to get better pedestrian outcomes. Okay, we've hit 4 minutes past, so we'd just like to say thank you all for listening, and there will be, as I said, a lot more information coming about pedestrian network guidance, and that will be through Waka Kotahi. So just keep your ears open to that through the various channels. We'll put something in our newsletter as well, just so that you are aware of what's coming up. So yeah, thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.